Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm going to be talking today about independence. This is an area where I've done quite a bit of professional publication in the field of formal epistemology, and what I want to do is to try to bring it together with biblical studies in a way that is interesting. Independence is very important in evaluating testimony, evaluating sources, and trying to come to know historical facts by way of reading or hearing sources that are claiming to give you factual information. In biblical studies, the so-called criterion of multiple attestation recognizes the value of independence, but that criterion is not always applied correctly because independence is very tricky. One of the reasons that I'm talking about independence in this very first video of this coming series is because I want to move on eventually and talk about casualness. And apparent casualness has factual value in certain contexts because it is an indicator of independence when we're talking about two different accounts. I'm not going to get into the details on that now, but that's one reason why I want to talk about independence is because later I want to talk about casualness. Independence is also very interesting and very important in and of itself in biblical studies. So what kind of independence do we want when we are looking at two or more sources that claim to tell us about something that happened? Maybe they're talking about the same event, or maybe they're talking about different events, but those apparently fit together in what I've called an undesigned coincidence, but we want to find out if it's really undesigned or not. So independence is the kind of thing we're always trying to evaluate, and a lot of times we're doing it by the seat of our pants, and it's important to come to a more precise understanding. The kind of independence that we're looking for is factual independence. Now, I know all of my professional YouTuber friends are going to be cringing because I'm using handmade diagrams. Those of you who are listening to this on audio content, we're going to try to get you a PDF or a document where you can just look up these diagrams quickly, or you could come over here to the video link and watch it over here. But what I have here is a diagram that is meant to represent factual independence, and it's labeled factual independence. So up here at the top, we have the facts. I thought of calling it reality. You could put reality in there. And then we have two sources, source A and source B. These might be written, they might be oral, one of them might be an inscription, all kinds of things. One of them might be Josephus and the other one might be a gospel, or they might be two people telling about a car accident. A lot of different things could be source A and source B. And there are arrows going from the facts to source A and to source B, but not meeting or crossing. The way I'm going to put this is that these arrows represent a flow of information. A flow of information from reality or the facts down to source E, from reality or the facts down to source B. Now, I want to clarify that that flow of information line does not mean that source A and source B are infallible, or that they couldn't be confused about any of this information, they couldn't make any mistakes, or something like that. It just means that there is some information going from the facts to source A. Source A might be completely correct in everything he says, or he might contain some errors. But this factual independence is useful because if we really have this scenario with factual independence, then there are specific probabilistic ways that we can model that will show that that's valuable for knowing that something really took place, something that they agree upon, or some way in which they seem to confirm one another mutually. If we have reason to believe in the factual independence, that adds value to the testimony of these two sources. Now, there are all kinds of other little complexities. For example, source A and source B might actually occur within the same document. They don't necessarily have to be separate documents. But I'm not going to talk about that in detail right now. Source A and source B could even be different times that a witness remembers and recounts the story, but tells it a little differently and is remembering back to the facts in both cases. So this could model a lot of different things. One other thing is that I haven't drawn any intervening nodes on these information lines, but there could be intervening nodes. You could have the facts, and then you could have a person over here who's telling source A what happened, and then maybe another person over here who's telling source B what happened. So even though I didn't draw intervening nodes, there could be intervening nodes. But the important thing is that each of these sources have information that goes back to the facts, and they're not wholly dependent upon one another here for what happened. We are often looking at clues and then trying to decide whether two sources are independent. We rarely have some kind of meta-level statement that, hey, we put these people separate, they didn't get a chance to talk to one another or something like that. Or the source saying, and I totally didn't get my information about this from that guy over there. We often don't have any comments to that effect. And so what we go by are clues in the accounts to try to say, does this appear to be independent of this other account? One other point I want to make is that while witness separation, which I just referred to, like where you don't let them talk to one another, is a kind of ideal or gold standard, it is not necessary for having this factual independence. So sometimes you'll have people saying, well, if the gospel authors even had ever read one another, they can't be factually independent. That's not true. Or if the disciples were talking to each other, they couldn't give accounts or stories that would be factually independent. Sure, if we could lock them up in separate rooms and say, now give me what you have to say and write it down, before we talk to the other guy, that would be great. But the important thing is that in fact, source A is not getting his facts from source B. He's getting his facts from the facts in some manner, either from some separate account from the one being used by source B, or maybe from his own memories or whatever, and he's attesting to that in a fashion that doesn't require the use of source B or of a source common to them both. Okay, so absolute witness separation is not required. Now, here's a model where there's no factual independence. Here we have the facts up at the top. Then we have source A. He's got some kind of information about what happened. And then we've got source B down below source A, and he's just getting his story from source A. He doesn't have any other factual information about what happened up here. So if you've got a story that's just coming through source A to source B, then there's no factual independence. And I think that does sometimes happen in the Gospels. I was just looking this up today. I think a good candidate for that kind of factual independence would be the two accounts in one in Matthew and one in Mark of Jesus' calling of the disciples along the Sea of Galilee. As far as I could tell when I was rereading it today, there aren't any facts contained in one of those sources, like Matthew, particularly, who's thought to have come later than Mark, that are not found in Mark. Matthew has a little digression on what he believes to have been a fulfillment of prophecy, but that's not anything additional about what happened. So where Jesus goes, he's going to live in Galilee, and then he's walking by the sea, and he calls Peter and Andrew, and then James and John. Not only is the wording very similar, which is some evidence, though not absolutely decisive, but it is some evidence that Matthew may have been using Mark as a source. But again, as I said, there's not additional information in Matthew about what happened that could indicate some other source of information. And there aren't any contradictions. And this is an interesting point, that contradictions can be a sign of independence. But we don't have any even apparent contradictions between those. So I would say that looks like a case like this, where maybe Mark is getting his information about what happened from Peter, who is said to have been Mark's source, and then Matthew would not have been a disciple yet at this time, and he could just be getting his information from Mark. So that does happen sometimes. The problem is, in biblical studies, particularly in historical Jesus studies, and especially when it comes to the synoptic gospels, scholars get trapped in this model. Facts, source A, source B, no factual independence, and the information line just running that way. They set it up as an absolute, and then they ignore information to the contrary. This happens all the time. One very striking type of information that they ignore to the contrary is apparent contradiction. So you will find a scholar who looks at a story that's found, let's say, in both Mark and Matthew, where there's an appearance of discrepancy between them, and he'll say, well, Matthew must have gotten this source from Mark because it's the same story, or must have gotten this story from Mark. It's the same story. There's similar wording, but Matthew appears to contradict Mark on this one point, so that must mean that Matthew felt free to alter the facts. And it never occurs to them that that very appearance of contradiction is some evidence that maybe Matthew had another source of facts that could, in principle, contradict Mark. They can't break free of that, so anything like that is taken as evidence of embellishment, not of separate facts. They'll also do it when there is no appearance of contradiction, but where there's just additional information. So source B might have some sayings of Jesus in the story that don't happen to be mentioned in source A, and the scholars will say, well, we're observing Matthew's use of Mark. And so when we're observing Matthew's use of Mark, we see that Matthew felt free to add stuff that didn't really happen, okay, to the story in Mark. That's because they've got these blinders on. They're assuming that this is the correct model, and that even when there is additional information in the source they're taking to be the wholly dependent source, they're ignoring the possibility that means he actually did have another source of information. But on the face of it, that's what that should mean. This is related to the issue of literary dependence and independence. Biblical scholars have a terrible habit of taking literary independence to be both necessary and sufficient for factual independence. I'm going to say that again. They tend to take literary independence to be both necessary and sufficient for factual independence, and in fact, it's neither. So if they see any evidence of literary independence, if they see any evidence of literary dependence, such as similar wording, let's say in two of the Gospels, maybe even quite similar wording, they'll say, aha, okay, source B is literarily dependent on source A. This must mean that source B is entirely factually independent, entirely factually dependent on source A. Okay, so they'll see this wording, they'll say, okay, he seems to have been using source A as a literary source, so he must be totally factually dependent. So they're taking literary dependence to be sufficient for complete factual dependence, or to put it the other way, they're taking literary independence to be a necessary condition for factual independence. Now that is not necessarily true. Don't get me wrong. Very similar wording is one of those clues of possible literary and factual dependence. It's a clue. We shouldn't overlook it. It's there. It's legitimate to use it, just as it's legitimate to use very different wording. as evidence of factual independence. But it shouldn't be controlling. We need to be careful not to be absolute about it, because there is a third scenario. Now, what I have this labeled as is partial factual independence. Up here at the top, we have the facts. We then have source A. He's got some information about the facts. We have source B. He's, let's say, getting some information from source A. Okay, so there is some factual dependence there. But then, look, we have another line over here from the facts to source B. And what this means is that source B has some information independently of source A. He's not getting all his information from source A. And so he's partially dependent, but he's partially independent for the facts. Now, I think we do find this in the Gospels, and especially in the Synoptic Gospels. I think that a case like this is the story of what Herod and his servants were talking about concerning who Jesus was and whether he was John the Baptist risen from the dead. You find this similarly in Matthew and in Mark, and the wording is even pretty similar. But Matthew has an additional piece of information. He says that Herod was saying this to his servants. Mark doesn't mention his servants. He just mentions what Herod was thinking about and what people were saying about who Jesus might be. But there's no statement that Herod said to his servants, this must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. So that appears to be a separate piece of information that Matthew has. Okay? And we actually find it confirmed that Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants based on an undesigned coincidence with a passage in a different context in Luke about Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. So we shouldn't be so quick to say, okay, if there's literary dependence, then it has to be this model where there's complete factual dependence. And so anything that we find in, say, Matthew or Luke that goes beyond what is in Mark must be made up. Any extra information must be an embellishment, must be factually added. They couldn't possibly have had any other source of information if they were using Mark. So, all right, literary independence is not absolutely necessary for some degree of factual independence. It's also not sufficient. So we're going to go to our last diagram here, where there is no factual independence. It's a kind of interesting one. So here we have the facts at the top. Then we have something that I've labeled tradition under the facts, and an information line, not necessarily infallible, remember, running from the facts to the tradition. And then down here at the bottom, coming from the tradition, we have source A and source B. So source A and source B have their facts only from this tradition. In this diagram, there is only one source about the facts. There's only one source of potentially, not necessarily infallible, but potentially factual information, and that is this tradition here. There's not multiple attestation, because source A and source B do not have their own separate lines back to the facts. Rather, the information flow goes from the facts to the tradition, and all they have is that tradition, and then they're doing something with that tradition. So whether we have the truth or not is going to depend on whether that tradition is accurate or not. And it's not going to be multiply attested. Now, I want to give a concrete example there because this is important, and that can seem a little bit abstract. So let me give a concrete example. Let's let the facts in that last diagram be let's say, the facts about Jesus' birth and his infancy, whatever those were, whatever the facts were. And then let's let that middle node of tradition stand for stuff that was believed by the Christians at a given time, relatively early, let's say prior to the writing of either Matthew or Luke, which are the only Gospels that have infancy stories. And let's let that tradition stand for the material that is the same in Matthew and Luke, where they're in agreement in their infancy stories. So I can think of several things right off. There may be more. We have that his mother's name was Mary, that his mother's husband's name was Joseph, that he was born in Bethlehem, and in both cases, both Matthew and Luke say that his mother was a virgin. So let's suppose that that was believed, those four things were believed by the Christians when they talked about it. We could call it an oral tradition. When they talked about Jesus' infancy and Jesus' birth, they gave those facts, all right? But they didn't give anything further that is unique to Matthew or unique to Luke. And then let's suppose, now I don't believe this, of course, that Matthew and Luke came along and that all they had for factual information was this common tradition, okay? They didn't have any other factual information. Matthew hadn't had a chance to talk to Joseph before he died, or to James, the brother of Jesus, and get a story. And Luke hadn't had a chance to talk to Mary or get any further information from Mary's family or anything like that. All they have is this tradition, this oral tradition. And let's then suppose that each of them says, well, this is kind of thin. This doesn't make a very good story. I'm going to add to that oral tradition. And so then whatever Matthew says that goes beyond this common tradition is invented. And suppose that whatever Luke has that goes beyond this common tradition is invented. So that would mean that Matthew invented the wise men, he invented the Star of Bethlehem, he invented the journey to Egypt and the slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. And it would mean that Luke invented the shepherds and the scenes in the temple with Anna and Simeon and that kind of thing. Do we have multiple attestation to the things that Matthew and Luke agree upon, such as that Jesus was born of a virgin? No, we do not. We have just this unadorned tradition, and whatever truth there is in that, however reliable that is. And of course we can't evaluate that very well because we don't have access. We're just guessing at what was in there. It's not like we have some account here that we could evaluate or check in other ways. So that tradition either is or isn't accurate, and then we just have separate embellishment of it. Now, in an online written debate that Dr. Michael Licona did with Bart Ehrman, he was not necessarily saying he believed this model that I've just given you. He even said he didn't know if it was true. But he was trying to say is that even if this model were true, and I think he probably regarded it as somewhat plausible, but set that aside, regardless of how plausible he thought it was, he was saying that even if that were the case, then the overlapping facts between Matthew and Luke would be multiply attested and therefore secure. That's not true, because the only independence that you have in that model that I just laid out is imagination, embellishment. They are independently, quote unquote, making extra stuff up to go beyond the tradition that they have access to, which is much more limited and minimal. Well, that doesn't mean we have multiple attestation to the facts. There are not multiple lines from these sources going back to the facts. They go back instead to that shared source. So independence is tricky. And I suspect that the reason it was regarded as independent was because of the idea in the model that Matthew hadn't read Luke and that maybe Luke hadn't read Matthew, the idea being that they're literarily independent. So then I think he was probably thinking, well, if they haven't read each other, they're literarily independent, then they are factually independent. But that's not necessarily true. So literary dependence is not in and of itself sufficient for factual independence, nor is it in and of itself necessary. Okay, that's a lot of material, but I find this type of material fascinating, and I hope you do too. And it's pretty important for biblical studies. As I go on, I'll be talking about casualness, particularly in undesigned coincidences and external confirmations, and how casualness can indicate independence. So I hope that you'll like and subscribe, and come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.